All right, so next I want to spend some time talking about the epidermis. And a lot of this focus is going to be on a lot of just, again, histology aspects of this. The layers of the epidermis and the cells that are contained within each layer of the epidermis and their basic functions. All right. So first, so let's kind of look at these layers of the epidermis. Well, first let's list all the cells of the epidermis, and then we'll talk about their basic functions and where they are found within the layers of the epidermis. All right. So first, and if you want to follow along with this, again, you got your PowerPoint, and there's some images with color on page 151. And again, if there are those of you out there who are watching this and use a different A&P textbook, there are going to be images that are very similar to what I'm describing here, so you can see all this stuff there. All right. Now, first, you have to remember that the lowest layer of the epidermis, okay, is called the stratum basale. Okay, the stratum basale. All right. Now the stratum basale. All right. Now the stratum basale begins. Now remember, like any other type of epithelial tissue, it begins at the basement membrane. Okay, the basement membrane. All right. So remember, basement membranes, when we're talking about epithelial tissues, are found underneath all types of epithelial cells. Okay. Now the reason why, remember that epithelial cells, these lining type tissues, all right, epithelial cells are very, very tightly packed together. All right, and in fact, they're packed so tightly together, there is no room for blood vessels to form networks in between these cells for the delivery of oxygen and elimination of waste. All right, so as a result, what you find with epithelial tissues is you find this gelatinous basement membrane, and directly underneath the basement membrane are the capillaries and blood vessels that deliver the nutrients and oxygen to these cells. And also, waste products from these cells pass through the basement membrane into blood vessels. All right. So remember, this is basically an exchange medium for the cells of the epithelium. All right. So again, that's the beginning of the epidermis of the skin. All right. The stratum basale, the basement membrane, and then you find cells that are located. There's a good chunk of cells that are located along the basement membrane, all right? And one of the types of cells, we'll kind of label with blue here, is a stem cell. Okay, one thing you have to remember about skin is, and especially the cells of the epidermis, this is a very high turnover type tissue. So what I mean when I say that is we're constantly, this tissue is constantly undergoing mitosis, constantly undergoing cell division. All right, and these stem cells are constantly generating new types of new cells. All right, and the most common type of cell you find in skin is called a keratinocyte. Okay, this is by far the most abundant cell type within, within the epidermis. All right, and these stem cells are constantly turning over into keratinocytes. They'll also turn over into other cells as well, but this is by far the most common one they're going into. All right, and these keratinocytes, these are this mass quantity of these cells are the ones that are tightly packed together that help us form this physical barrier. All right, but one thing you have to remember though, now is as we produce more keratinocytes, as we produce brand new ones, all right, the old ones are pushed up. And they're pushed up and away. So they're pushed up away from the bottom. They're pushed up away from the basement membrane. All right. So what you should be thinking then, what happens to these cells? All right. As they get farther from the basement membrane, they slowly start to change. You see morphological, meaning physical changes in the cell because they're getting farther and farther away from their source of oxygen and nutrients. And as a result, they start to slowly die. All right. And then, all right, so that's what keratinocytes do. All right, so as these stem cells turn over and form new keratinocytes and other new cells, the old ones are pushed up away from the bottom towards the top of the epidermis. All right, and like I said, this is eventually going to result in the death of these cells, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. Okay. So there's stem cells, there's keratinocytes, and there are cells that are called melanocytes that are found very close to the basement membrane. And melanocytes produce, you guys have heard of this before, the pigment melanin. Okay, remember melanin is a protein that is designed to basically trap energy from the sun and capture that energy and prevent it from hitting the cells of the skin and damaging them. Okay, so that's what melanocytes do. They crank out melanin. Think of melanin as just an all natural sunblock that we produce. Okay, and now this is what happens. As let's say you're more of a pale complexion. You go outside to tan. All right, what's going to happen is that sunlight is going to come in and it's going to go through the epidermis and it's going to start to damage these keratinocytes. It's going to start to damage these cells. All right, so then as a result, what's going to happen is you're going to start to turn out more melanocytes, and these melanocytes are going to start to produce more pigment, more melanin. All right, so at first, when you get sunburn, you know that your skin turns red. All right, your skin turns red, and then after a while, once the redness goes away, your skin takes on that darker complexion, and that's why. Because you're trying to protect yourself from that excessive exposure to the sun by cranking out more melanin. That's what the tan is, an increased concentration of melanin within the epidermis, all right? And in the long run, it's really not a good thing. I know there are people that are, that spend time outside, that work outside. It's good to be out in the sun, but overexposure to sunlight, this process isn't going to work as efficiently when you're older than it did when you were young. So that means as you get older and you have a harder time cranking out melanin and turning out melanocytes, you're going to have more and more damage to the cells. And you guys remember from your biology classes that as you damage cells and damage DNA, that may generate, through mitosis, irregular and bad cells, and that's where cancers come from. Okay, so excessive sun tanning is not a good thing. All right, fake bathing in the wintertime it's just not a good idea. Okay, it's not a good idea. Get your exposure to the sun that you need, but don't overdo it. All right. What else was I going to say? And then there are other cells that are found, very close to the epidermis, to the basement membrane of the epidermis, called tactile cells. I know this looks a little clustered, but we'll say that's a tactile cell. So typically what a tactile cell is, it's a cell that has a nerve right underneath it. Okay, it's got a nerve right underneath it. So what happens when you press on the epidermis and pressure is applied downward through the epidermis, all right, it's going to hit this cell. All right, and then as cellular changes occur due to mechanical pressure, that's going to make this nerve start sending impulses to your brain, and that's how you start to feel pressure. More the lighter kind of pressure, because the epidermis is is the most superficial layer of skin. Within your dermis, there are other deep receptors found in there. Okay, so all these cells that I just mentioned, stem cells, melanocytes, tactile cells, and lots of keratinocytes are all found very close to the basement membrane, which is in the lowest layer of the epidermis called the stratum basale. All right, the stratum basale. All right, then next, as we work our way up, all right, I'm going to erase this mess here a little bit.